She helped a stranger trapped in the mud, unaware he was the Duke who owned her father's land. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. On a stormy night at the edge of a tiny village, Clara Hart braced her shoulder against a barn door that the wind kept trying to rip from her hands. Rain hammered the old wooden roof like 100 fists, and cold air slid through every crack in the walls. Her fingers were numb, her dress soaked through, but she pushed the last sack of potatoes inside, as if the harvest itself depended on her stubbornness. Behind her, through the thin wall, she could hear her father coughing, deep and ragged, each sound tearing through the quiet like a warning bell. Clara wiped mud from her cheek with the back of her sleeve, tasting the grit of the long day on her tongue. It was past 10, but the fields did not care about the time, and neither did the overdue rent notice sitting folded on the rough-hewn table inside. Out here, the world measured itself not in hours, but in how many days you had left before someone rode up to your door and told you the land under your feet no longer belonged to you. She latched the barn door and turned toward the house when a strange sound cut through the roar of the storm. Not thunder, not wind, wood splintering, iron scraping, a horse's panicked whinny. The noise came from the dirt road that wound past their fields and climbed toward the distant estate that owned half the county. For a heartbeat, Clara stood still, rain running down her neck, listening. No one traveled this road at night unless they had to. The village went dark with the sun. Only the desperate and the powerful moved after midnight. Another crash, louder this time, followed by the sickening grind of a wheel stuck deep in wet earth. Without thinking, she grabbed the old lantern by the door, cupped her hand around the flame, and ran. Mud sucked at her boots as she crossed the yard. The rain had turned the familiar path into a slick mess that seemed determined to pull her down with every step. By the time she reached the road, her hem was heavy with water, clinging to her legs. In the weak light of the lantern, she saw it. A dark carriage tilted at an angle, one wheel buried almost to the axle in a deep rut, the kind that formed when too many wagons took the same path after heavy rain. One of the horses reared, eyes wide, hooves striking dangerously close to the man trying to hold the reins. He was tall, dressed in a long black coat now streaked with mud, his hair plastered to his forehead, boots sinking as he fought to steady the animal. For a second, with the wind whipping his coat and the lantern's light flickering across his face, he looked like he had stepped out of some other world, one of polished floors and chandeliers, not broken fences and leaky roofs. Clara did not know who he was. She only saw that he was about to be dragged under the rearing horse if he lost his grip on the reins. "Hold on," she shouted over the storm, her voice sharper than she felt. He turned, startled by the sudden light and the small figure running toward him from a house, so plain it almost vanished in the darkness. He opened his mouth to protest, but by then Clara was already in the mud beside him, lantern set on a rock, hands reaching for the tangled harness. In that moment, she was not the daughter of a sick farmer on borrowed land, and he was not a stranger in fine boots. They were just two people in the rain, fighting the same wild, frightened animal and the same hungry road trying to swallow them whole. The reins burned against his palms as the horse tossed its head, snorting in panic. Clara stepped in close, planting her boots in the mud as if she could root herself into the earth by sheer force of will. "Easy, boy, easy," she said, her voice low and firm, cutting through the roar of the rain. The stranger glanced at her, surprised that someone so small would stand so near flailing hooves. "You should step back," he said, breathless. "If he kicks, you will be hurt." Clara did not move. "If he gets free, you will be dragged," she answered. "We both stay. Pull when I say." She slid a hand along the damp leather, patting the trembling neck of the horse, letting it feel the steady pressure of her touch. In the lantern light, his fine coat shone dark and slick with water. The animal's breath came in harsh puffs, white against the cold night. Clara reached for the rope that kept the harness in place and spoke softly, the way her father had taught her when she was a little girl and their one old mare had been the only thing standing between them and hunger. There now? You are all right. No one is going to let you fall. The stranger listened, as if the words calmed him as much as the horse. At her signal, he pulled the reins just as she guided the horse's head sideways, away from the hole. The animal scrambled, hooves sliding, but its weight shifted. One more lunge, and the horse found solid ground. The carriage rocked, groaned, and settled, its wheel still sunk, but no longer at the dangerous angle that promised disaster. Clara hurried to the buried wheel, peering into the rut. The rain had carved it deep, turning the road into a trap. You are not getting out of this without help, she said. My house is just there. She pointed toward the small shape barely visible in the dark. We have an old horse and a rope that has one more job left in it. The man wiped water from his brow with the back of his hand. Even covered in mud, his voice carried a certain authority, the kind that did not come from working the fields. I did not mean to trouble anyone, he replied. I thought the road was better kept. Clara almost laughed at that, a short, tired sound. The road is kept as well as the people who own it keep their promises, she said. Wait here. Try not to sink any deeper. She ran back across the yard, the lantern swinging, her breath sharp in her chest. Inside the barn, she grabbed the coil of rope her father used for hauling hay and let out their tired brown horse, murmuring apologies into its worn ear. When she returned, the stranger had moved to the side of the carriage, inspecting the axle with a frown that did not match his expensive coat. She secured the rope around the stuck wheel and tied the other into her own horse, tightening each knot with hands that knew this work far too well. When I signal, your driver will guide the horse forward, she said. Mine will pull from this side. Do not fight the mud. Let it give way slowly. He seemed about to question her, then stopped. Very well, he said quietly. You lead. It took 3 attempts, each one a struggle of straining leather and sliding boots, but finally the wheel broke free. Mud splashed across Clara's skirt, up his coat, even onto the carriage door. For a moment, they both stood there, breathing hard, listening to the storm and to the sudden quiet of the horse now standing steady. The stranger looked at her more closely, as if seeing beyond the mud on her face and the frayed edges of her sleeves. You could have stayed inside, he said. Most people would have. Most people do not live this close to the road, Clara answered. When something breaks out here, no one comes unless you are the one who goes first. She noticed the way he shifted his weight, a hint of stiffness in one leg, as if an old injury still troubled him. The wind cut between them, sharp and cold. You should come in and warm yourself, she said abruptly. The fire is small, but it is better than standing here. He hesitated, glancing toward the distant line of trees that led to the upper road, the one that climbed to the unseen estate on the hill. I will manage, he replied, almost too quickly. But thank you, Miss Hart, she said. Clara Hart. He repeated the name as if testing it. Thank you, Miss Hart. He placed a hand over his chest in a brief, old-fashioned gesture that felt too formal for the mud and the storm. Then he climbed back into the carriage. The driver clicked his tongue, the team moved forward, and the dark shape rolled slowly down the road, vanishing into the curtain of rain. Clara watched until the lantern light on the carriage disappeared. Only then did she turn, back toward the house, her clothes heavy, her boots full of cold water. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and medicine. Her father lay on the narrow bed by the stove, his gray hair damp with sweat, the lines around his mouth carved deeper by pain and worry. Was that thunder? He asked, his voice rough. Clara set the lantern down and forced a smile that reached her eyes only halfway. Just the road arguing with a fool who thought he could fight the mud, she said. She covered him with the patched blanket and sat beside him, listening to the storm move farther away. She did not know that by helping a stranger in the dark, she had already stepped into a story that started long before that will sink into the earth, and that by morning, the cost of that same earth would come knocking on their door. Morning crept in slowly, pushing the storm away and leaving the sky the color of old ashes. The fields behind the Hart house were slick and heavy, rows of soil shining dark and wet. Clara woke to the sound of her father coughing, not to rain. The quiet after a storm always felt wrong to her, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for something else to break. She stirred the coals in the stove until they glowed and added a small log, watching the flame catch. The room brightened, revealing every crack in the walls, every place where the wind had pushed its way in over the years. Her father lay on the narrow bed, his face pale, his chest rising and falling too quickly for someone who had done nothing but lie still. "You should sleep," he rasped as she brought him a cup of water. "You were out there half the night." "The road needed convincing," Clara said, forcing a little warmth into her tone. It lost. She did not mention the stranger, the carriage, or the way his voice had carried a weight that did not belong to farmers or village traders. Some things felt easier to keep to herself for a while, as if speaking them aloud would somehow change them. Her father took a sip and looked toward the small window. From there, all he could see was the gray light and the crooked fence that tried its best to stand against the wind. "Storm like that will not be good for the fields," he said. "We will be lucky if the early planting takes." His hand moved, searching for hers. She gave it without hesitation. "We will manage," she replied. She always said that. It had become a kind of prayer, thin but stubborn. A knock came at the door. Not the hesitant tap of a neighbor, but a sharp, measured sound, as if the knuckles that made it were used to doors opening quickly. Clara felt her spine straighten before she even rose. The second knock came before she reached the handle, impatient and exact. When she opened the door, a rush of cold air swept in, along with a man in a dark coat that had never seen real work. He was in his late 30s, maybe older, with a narrow face and eyes that took in everything in one quick glance. Behind him, a horse waited, clean and restless, its saddle free of mud despite the state of the road. "Good morning," the man said, though there was nothing warm in his voice. "Miss Hart, I presume." Clara gripped the edge of the door. "Yes," she answered. "May I help you with something?" He stepped just far enough inside to get out of the wind, eyes flicking briefly to the bed where her father lay. "My name is Edwin Crow," he said. "I am the steward of Ashbourne estate. I represent His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne, who owns this land and several hundred acres beyond it." The words hung in the air like a sentence already passed. The title felt too large for the little room, too polished for the rough boards under their feet. Her father tried to sit up, coughing as he did so. Clara moved to help him, but Edwin did not step forward or backward. He simply waited, as if time itself belonged to him. When her father was propped against the thin pillow, Edwin reached into his coat and drew out a folded piece of paper, its edges crisp, the seal dark and unbroken. "This is an official notice," Edwin said. "There have been several attempts to collect overdue rent on this property. The records show that no payments have been made for 3 consecutive terms." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "That is not true," she said quietly. "My father has paid what he could, when he could. We have the receipts." Edwin did not look at her. He looked at the notice instead, as if it were more deserving of his attention. "The ledgers at Ashbourne tell a different story," he replied. "According to them, you are in significant arrears. His Grace has been patient, but patience has limits, even for a man of his standing." He held out the paper. Clara took it, her fingers trembling despite her effort to keep them steady. The words were neatly written, the ink dark, the signature at the bottom a name she had never read on anything that belonged to her before: Adrian Ashbourne, Duke of Ashbourne. The letters were strong, decisive, the kind that did not expect to be questioned. The notice gave a clear deadline: 2 weeks. 14 days for a household that measured money in single coins, not lines on a ledger. "If the debt is not paid in full by that time," Edwin continued, "the estate will reclaim this property. The house, the barn, and the land will revert to the ownership of Ashbourne. You will be expected to vacate." His words were smooth, as if he had said the same thing many times in many kitchens just like theirs. Clara lifted her eyes from the page to his face. "This land is my father's life," she said. "He has worked it since he was a boy. The last duke promised fair treatment to the tenants. Does that promise mean nothing now?" Edwin's expression did not change. "Promises do not pay debts, Miss Hart," he said. "Coin does." Her father's hand gripped the blanket, knuckles white. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and settled for a rough whisper. "Ask him," he said, the words scraping their way out. "Ask this steward if the Duke himself sent him to do this." Edwin glanced at the old man, then at Clara. "The Duke has entrusted me with managing his affairs," he said. "He does not concern himself with every small detail of every field. That is why men like me exist. The answer should not have surprised Clara, but it still stung. Somewhere on that high hill, she imagined a man in a grand house, far from the smell of damp straw and medicine, signing papers that pushed people like them closer to the edge of nowhere. Edwin turned toward the door, drawing his coat tighter around his shoulders. "You have 14 days, he repeated. "I suggest you use them wisely." Then he stepped out into the pale morning and closed the door behind him, leaving the cold and the echo of his words inside. For a long moment after the door closed, the only sound in the small house was the ticking of the old clock on the shelf, counting out seconds that suddenly felt far too loud. Clara stared at the notice in her hands until the words blurred, then forced herself to read them again, tracing each line as if, by sheer will, she could make them say something else. 14 days. Pay in full. Vacate the premises. Her father coughed, the sound rough and unfinished. "Let me see it," he said. She sat on the edge of the bed and placed the paper in his hands. They shook as he held it, the skin thin, the veins raised like a map of every season he had spent bent over the fields. His eyes moved slowly, lips working around the words. When he reached the bottom, his shoulders sagged as if someone had cut the last rope holding him upright. "I paid," he whispered. "I paid what we owed. Not all at once, but I paid. Your mother would never have let me fall behind." Clara squeezed his arm gently. "We have the receipts," she reminded him. "You kept them in the wooden box, under the chest." Saying it aloud steadied her, like gripping the handle of a tool she knew well. She crossed the room, pushed aside the worn trunk, and pulled out the small box he had carved years ago from a fallen branch. Inside, neat bundles of folded slips waited, tied with string, each one bearing a date, an amount, and the shaky signature of a steward who had served the previous duke. She spread them on the table, arranging them in order, a paper timeline of effort and sacrifice. Some were older, yellowed around the edges, but the more recent ones still held the sharp smell of ink. "These are real," she said. "He cannot simply say they do not exist." Her father closed his eyes. "He can," he answered quietly. "If the man in the big house never hears our names at all, it is easy for someone like that steward to speak for him." Clara looked toward the small window, where the hill that led to Ashbourne was only a gray outline in the distance. Somewhere beyond that line of trees stood a house large enough to cast a shadow over families who had never stepped inside it. "Then we will make sure he hears our names," she said. "The Duke may not know what his steward does in his name. If he is the one who owns this land, then he should be the one to look us in the eye when he takes it." Her father shook his head faintly. "Clara, that hill is not for the likes of us. Tenants do not walk into that house and ask questions." "Maybe they should," she replied. The thought scared her, but the fear sat beside something fiercer, something that had flared to life the moment Edwin Crow turned his back on them. The day moved on in thin slices. Clara fed her father, changed the cloth on his forehead, and tucked the notice into the box with the receipts, as if keeping all the papers together might force them to tell one complete story instead of two competing ones. Later, she walked into the village for flour and medicine. The road, still drying from the storm, sucked at her boots in places, releasing them with a soft sound like a sigh. At the small general store, she heard the news before she even crossed the threshold. Two women by the door were whispering, their voices low but urgent. "They say the new duke came back last night," one said. "Returned to Ashbourne at last." "About time," the other replied. "Though I hear he is not like his father. Harder, colder. A war changes a man, they say." A man near the counter chimed in, adjusting his cap. "There is to be a reception day next week. Tenants and tradesmen can bring petitions. The steward will hear them. Maybe the duke will too, if he can be bothered to leave his study." Clara paid for what she needed, listening to every word without seeming to. A reception day, a time when doors that usually remained closed might stand open, even if only a little. She walked back home with the small sack of flour under one arm, the medicine bottle wrapped carefully in cloth. The hill toward Ashbourne loomed to her right, shaded by trees that had never belonged to her family. As she climbed the last rise before her house, she paused and looked toward it, the shape of the distant estate just visible against the pale afternoon sky. Somewhere up there, a man with the same name written at the bottom of her notice was going about his life, perhaps reviewing accounts, perhaps thinking about anything but the people whose days he could shorten with a stroke of his pen. 14 days, she murmured to herself. If that is all the time he has given us, I will not spend it waiting for someone else to speak for us. When she stepped back into the house, her father opened his eyes, as if he had been listening for her footsteps. You are thinking something, he said. She set the flower down and sat beside him once more. I am thinking, she answered slowly, that if Ashbourne estate can send a man like Edwin Crow to our door, then I can walk to theirs. I will go up to the house on the hill. I will speak to the Duke himself. Her father stared at her, fear and pride warring in his tired gaze. That world will not be kind to you, he warned. Clara folded the notice and slipped it into her pocket, feeling the stiff paper press against her palm. The world down here has not been kind either, she said softly. At least up there, I can put a face to the hand that signs our fate. The hill to Ashbourne looked steeper when Clara began to climb it with purpose instead of simply glancing at it from her window. Morning mist clung to the trees, softening their edges, and the road that wound upward had the careful, measured feel of a path that only certain kinds of boots usually touched. She wore her best dress, which meant only that it had fewer patches than the others, and her cleanest shawl, mended so many times that the thread itself told a story of stubbornness. In her pocket, the notice from Ashbourne pressed against her palm, the Duke's signature like a weight she could not set down. The wooden box with the receipts remained at home under the trunk, but she had taken the most recent slips and folded them flat inside the same pocket, close to the notice that denied they existed. Her father had watched her leave from the doorway, blanket around his shoulders, leaning heavily on the frame. If they speak to you as if you are nothing, he had said, his voice hoarse, remember that the soil on their boots comes from land that men like me kept alive. She had nodded, unable to trust her own voice, and now she carried his words with her too, invisible but present. As she climbed higher, the village below grew smaller, the roofs like scattered pieces of dark cloth against the fields. The road widened, lined for a stretch with low stone walls that looked too smooth to be anything but decorative. The air grew cooler, fresher, as if it had not yet been breathed by too many people. Ahead, the gates of Ashbourne came into view, iron bars tall and dark, their curves forming a pattern that might have been beautiful if it had not been built to keep people out. Two men stood on either side, straight-backed, wearing uniforms that fit them too well to be anything but livery. Their hands rested on the tops of their canes, but their eyes were the real barriers. Clara approached with her shoulders square, every step deliberate. When she reached the gate, one of the men lifted his chin slightly. State your business, he said. His tone was not unkind, but it was flat, as if he already knew that whatever she said would not matter. My name is Clara Hart, she replied. My father rents land from Ashbourne. I have come to speak to the Duke about an error in the accounts. The men exchanged a look. The Duke does not receive tenants without arrangement, the first one said. There is a petition day next week. You may present your concerns then, through the steward. Clara drew the folded notice from her pocket and held it up, the paper stiff in her fingers. The deadline is 14 days from the date this was delivered, she said. By next week, we will have only a few days left. That is barely enough time to gather the money they say we owe, even if we could find it. I am not here to complain about weather or fences. I am here because the records are wrong, and if I do not correct them, my father will lose his home. Something in her voice, quiet but unshaken, made the younger of the two guards look away for a moment. The older one exhaled slowly. Wait here, he said. He disappeared through a smaller side door set into the stone wall. Clara stood before the iron bars, feeling the boundary they represented in more ways than one. On her side of the gate, the road was dirt, marked by wagon tracks. Beyond it, the path turned to smooth stone, pale and even, leading to a wide courtyard. The house itself rose beyond that, a sweep of pale stone and dark windows, each one reflecting the gray sky. It did not look like something that had grown from the land, the way her house and barn did. It looked as if it had been placed there by some other hand, heavy enough to bend the lives around it. After a few minutes, the guard returned. You may enter the outer hall, he said. The steward is there this morning. He will decide if your matter is worth the Duke's time. The gate creaked open, the sound long and low. Clara stepped through, the soles of her boots moving from uneven dirt to smooth stone. The change in texture traveled up through her legs, into her spine. Each footstep echoed a little. Servants crossed the courtyard, carrying baskets or ledgers, their eyes sliding past her with polite indifference. Inside, the entrance hall was tall enough to make her tilt her head back. Light fell through high windows, catching dust in the air like drifting snow. Portraits lined the walls, faces from other years staring down with the calm certainty of people who had never worried about a rent notice in their lives. Edwin Crowe stood near a long table piled with papers, speaking to a man with a ledger under his arm. He looked smaller indoors, but no less sharp, like a knife laid flat. When he saw Clara, his brows rose slightly, then lowered. "Miss Hart," he said, "I did not expect to see you here. I trust there is no confusion about the notice I delivered." "There is confusion in your books, not in my understanding," Clara answered, keeping her tone even. "We have receipts that say the debt is not what you claim. I have come to ask that the Duke be told of this." A flicker of impatience crossed his face. "His Grace does not need to be troubled with the particulars of every tenant's payments," Edwin replied. "That is why he has me." "Then I am asking you," Clara said, as the man who speaks for him, "to look at what I have brought." She took one of the folded slips from her pocket and laid it on the table beside his stack of papers. Edwin glanced down. For a moment, something like caution touched his expression, then vanished beneath a smooth surface. "Old receipts," he said. "These matters are not as simple as one piece of paper, Miss Hart. The ledgers at Ashbourne are quite clear." Clara felt heat rise in her chest, but she did not let it reach her voice. "Clear to whom?" she asked. "Clear to those who write in them, or clear to those who pay what they can and trust that it is recorded honestly?" Before Edwin could answer, a door at the far end of the hall opened. Conversation dipped, like a wave pulling back from the shore. A man stepped through, taller than Edwin, his dark hair swept back, his bearing straight despite a very faint stiffness in his left leg. He wore no coat now, only a dark waistcoat and a white shirt, but there was no mistaking the ease with which the space adjusted around him. The steward straightened. "Your Grace," Edwin said. Clara did not move. She only watched as the man from the muddy road, now clean and composed under the high ceilings of his own house, crossed the hall. He did not yet see her clearly, but just for a heartbeat. Something in his gaze caught on the sight of a young woman in a plain dress standing at the edge of his world, one hand resting on the paper that bore his name. For a heartbeat, the hall seemed to narrow around the three of them. Edwin bowed his head just enough to be proper, while Clara stood still, feeling the air shift as every eye in the room deferred to the man who had just entered. Adrian Ashbourne's gaze swept the space, pausing on the table, the ledgers, and finally on the slip of paper lying beside them. His eyes then found Clara's face. Up close, without rain and darkness between them, she did not recognize him as the man whose coat she had pulled from the mud, only as someone whose presence changed the temperature of the room. He, however, knew her at once. The memory of her hand on the reins, her voice steady in the storm, flashed through him so sharply that for a single second his practiced composure almost slipped. "Your Grace," Edwin said, recovering the moment faster. "Just a minor matter. A tenant with concerns about her rent." He spoke the word tenant the way some people mentioned a broken fence post, something that would be fixed or discarded as needed. Adrian did not look away from Clara. "Her name," he said quietly. "Clara Hart, Your Grace," Edwin supplied. "Her father rents one of the eastern parcels. They are in arrears. I have explained the situation and the deadline. There is nothing more that needs your attention here." There was a hint of insistence on that last sentence that Adrian did not entirely like. He shifted his weight, his left leg protesting the movement with a familiar dull ache, and let his fingers rest lightly on the back of a nearby chair. "Is that so, Miss Hart?" he asked. His voice was deeper than she had expected, controlled but not unkind. Clara swallowed, aware that speaking meant stepping over a line she could not step back from. "Your Grace," she said, forcing the words past the dryness in her throat. "Your steward has told me that my father and I owe more than we can pay in the time given. But I have brought receipts that show payments made. I am not asking for charity. I am asking that what we have already given be counted." A murmur passed through a couple of clerks at the far side of the hall, quickly silenced by Edwin's sharp glance. Adrian reached for the slip of paper on the table and studied it. The ink was slightly faded, the date clear, the signature at the bottom not his, but belonging to the previous steward. He looked at the figure entered, Then at Clara. "You say there are more of these," he said. "Yes, your grace," she answered. "My father kept them all. He trusted that if there was ever a question, the papers would speak for us." Edwin shifted subtly. "Old receipts, from previous terms," he said. "The ledgers have been reorganized since then. Whatever was due has been properly recorded. I can assure you of that." Adrian did not immediately reply. He set the receipt down and straightened, his expression unreadable. "Assurance is a fine word, Mr. Crow," he said. "But numbers do not care about assurances. They care about accuracy." He turned his attention back to Clara. "You came up here alone to present this," he observed. "Most would have waited for petition day. Most do not have a father who cannot climb this hill," she said softly. "And most, I think, do not have only 14 days left to stop their house from being taken." The plainness of her words struck him harder than any carefully crafted speech could have. There was no flattery, no attempt to win him with anything but truth. For a moment, another scene rose in his mind. Her face lit by lantern light, rain dripping from her hair, the rope between her hands as she had pulled his carriage free. He had ridden away that night without even giving his name, leaving her with nothing but mud on her skirt and a stranger's brief thanks. Now here she was again, on his floor, in his hall, holding a scrap of paper that bore his title like a blade. "Mr. Crow," Adrian said finally, his gaze never leaving Clara's, "have you compared these receipts with the amounts recorded in the old ledgers?" Edwin's jaw tightened by the smallest degree. "There has been no need, your grace," he replied. "The current balance is based on—" "That was not my question," Adrian interrupted, the softness in his tone cooling into something firmer. "Have you compared them yourself?" A beat of silence answered him, more revealing than any word. "I will review this matter personally," Adrian said. "Miss Hart, you will leave all relevant receipts with us today. Until I have examined the records, no steps will be taken to remove you or your father from your land." Edwin's head snapped toward him. "Your grace, if we begin to delay every enforcement for every complaint, the tenants will think." "They will think," Adrian cut in, "that Ashbourne can tell the difference between a lie and an error, and that their duke does not sign away homes without knowing which it is." He turned back to Clara. "There is a small anteroom just off this hall. You will wait there while the papers are gathered. When I have looked through them, I will speak with you again." Clara felt something inside her unclench, not in relief exactly, but in recognition that the door she had slammed her courage against had, for the first time, opened even a fraction. She nodded. "Yes, your grace," she said. As she moved toward the doorway he had indicated, she passed close enough to him to smell faint traces of rain on wool, an echo of another night. For a fleeting instant, she wondered why that scent made her chest tighten with something like memory, even though, as far as she knew, she had never stood this close to a duke before in her life. The anteroom was small compared to the hall, but to Clara it still felt larger than her entire house. A narrow window let in a band of pale light that fell across a pair of chairs and a low table. Someone had placed a vase there, holding a few winter branches that had no blossoms, only tight buds, as if even the plants in Ashbourne were waiting for permission to open. She sat on the edge of one chair, hands clasped in her lap, the roughness of her own skin rubbing against itself. Through the door, she heard faint sounds from the hall, footsteps, the quiet murmur of voices, the soft scratch of a pen moving over paper somewhere beyond. Time stretched strangely. Each minute felt like it contained far too much of her life. Her father's face kept rising in her mind, the way his eyes had dulled when he read the notice, the way his fingers trembled over the old receipts. She forced herself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale as if she were steadying a nervous horse. In another part of the house, Adrian moved through a corridor lined with shelves until he reached his study. The room smelled of ink, old paper, and the faint trace of wood smoke from the fire that burned low in the grate. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the hall, but not the small figure of Clara Hart that his memory insisted on carrying inside. Edwin followed, a pace behind, carrying a stack of ledgers as if they were armor. "If I may, your grace," Edwin began, "there is really no need for you to trouble yourself with this. The Hart account is a minor one among many. The totals are accurate." Adrian crossed to the large desk, the surface covered in maps of his lands, letters from London, and lists of supplies. He pushed some of it aside and laid Clara's receipt in the center, then nodded to the ledgers. "Open the volume for the year this receipt records," he said. "We will begin there." Edwin hesitated, then did as he was told. The leather creaked as he laid the book flat. Pages rustled, covered in neat columns of numbers and names. Adrian leaned on the edge of the desk, his injured leg reminding him of its presence with a dull throb. He ignored it, tracing a finger down the entries until he found the heart name. The amount recorded did not match what was written on Clara's receipt. It was close, but not the same, as if a small piece had been chipped away. "Explain this difference," Adrian said. Edwin cleared his throat. "There are sometimes fees, Your Grace. Adjustments. It is possible that the previous steward did not record them clearly for the tenants, but the balance here is correct." Adrian's eyes moved to another name on the page, another tenant he did not know personally, and then to a third. In each case, the amounts in the ledger were slightly higher than what the receipts showed. Not enough to draw attention from someone who did not look closely, but enough to build into something substantial over years. A quiet, steady draining. "You discovered these discrepancies when?" Adrian asked. Edwin shifted again. "There are always minor irregularities when one takes over another man's books," he said. "I have done my best to standardize them. It is a complicated process." Adrian closed the ledger gently, as if it were something fragile that still needed to be handled with care, even as it betrayed him. "Complication is not an excuse for confusion," he replied. "These people pay with their lives, Mr. Crow, with their time and their backs, and whatever coins they can spare. If our records do not reflect that accurately, it is not a minor matter." He straightened, feeling the pull in his leg and another kind of pull in his chest, one that came from remembering how it had felt to sink into the mud, the panic in the dark, and the small, firm hands that had pulled him out. He had ridden away that night without learning her name, telling himself that some debts could not be repaid. Now that same girl sat in his house, asking him not for repayment, but for fairness. "You will gather every receipt the Hart family has," Adrian said quietly. "You will compare them to every entry made in this estate's books over the last years. Not just theirs. Any tenant whose payments pass through your hands. You will prepare a full report for me within the week." Edwin's polite mask tightened. "Your Grace, that is an enormous amount of work. Perhaps we could focus only on this one account for now." Adrian met his gaze, and something in his own did not yield. "If there is a sickness in the system, it is not enough to treat one symptom," he said. "You will do as I have asked." Silence settled, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. Eventually Edwin bowed his head. "As you wish, Your Grace," he said. When Adrian left the study and returned toward the anteroom, his steps were slower. The ache in his leg was stronger now, but the ache in his conscience was sharper. He paused at the door, his hand on the latch, and for a moment he simply listened. Inside, Clara's breathing was very quiet, almost lost beneath the ticking of a small clock on the mantel. He opened the door. She rose at once, straightening her shawl, her eyes searching his face for an answer he had not yet decided how to give. "Miss Hart," he said, and he noticed how the name fit more firmly on his tongue now that he understood at least part of what had been done in her shadow. "I have begun to look into your account. There are questions that must be answered, and they will take time. Until they are, I will not allow any action to be taken against your home." The relief that washed over her was not the wild kind that made a person collapse. It was quieter than that, a loosening of her shoulders, a deeper breath. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "That is more than anyone else has been willing to do." He held her gaze. "It is only the beginning of what must be done," he replied. And as he said it, he could not shake the sense that their lives had already crossed in ways that neither ledger nor notice could fully record. For the first time since Edwin Crow had stepped into her house with his polished boots and cold notice, Clara walked down the hill from Ashbourne with something other than dread pressing on her chest. The sky above was still gray, the air still cool, and the road still rutted where wagon wheels had bitten deep after the storm, but there was a sliver of space inside her where panic had eased. It was not gone, but it had loosened its grip, enough for her to breathe without feeling as if each breath might be her last as a tenant on that land. She replayed the Duke's words in her mind as she descended, each one measured, as if she were trying to fit them into the shape of the man who had spoken them. "I will not allow any action to be taken against your home." He had not promised miracles, only time and a willingness to look at the truth, yet somehow those simple things felt rare enough to be almost unbelievable. At the bend in the road, she paused and looked back up the hill. From this distance, the house was a pale shape against the dull sky, its many windows dark. It did not look less imposing just because one man inside it had listened to her. Still, something had shifted. It was not that the house had grown smaller, but that she no longer felt entirely invisible beneath it. She thought of the way his gaze had met hers, steady and direct, not sliding past her as if she were only part of the furniture of his estate. There had been surprise there, and something else she could not name, as if a question had formed behind his eyes at the sight of her. She turned away before she could begin to imagine answers that did not exist, and continued down toward the village. At home, her father was sitting up in bed, the blanket pulled tight around his shoulders, his eyes fixed on the doorway. The moment she stepped inside, he read her face before she had spoken a single word. "Well?" he asked, his voice rough with worry and the remnants of a restless morning. "Did he send you back with another paper? Or with a door shut in your face?" Clara set her shawl aside and came to sit at the edge of the bed. "Neither," she said. "He has ordered that nothing be done until he has examined the records himself." He took the receipts seriously. He spoke to Mr. Crow as if what we showed him mattered. Her father let out a slow breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no amusement in it, only release. "The Duke himself," he said, as if testing the idea on his tongue. "I spent my life thinking men like that did not know we existed, except as numbers on a page." Clara thought of the ledgers, the neat lines of ink, and the way Adrian Ashbourne had frowned at the small differences between what the receipts showed and what the books claimed. "I think he believed the numbers told him enough," she answered quietly. "Now he has seen the people standing behind them." Her father studied her face with a sharpness that illness had not taken from him. "And what did you see?" he asked. "When you looked at him?" She hesitated, remembering the set of Adrian's shoulders, the slight stiffness in his step, the faint shadow of tiredness at the edge of his eyes, as if he lived with some pain that did not fully leave, even in a house filled with comfort. She thought of how he had spoken to her, how he had corrected his steward without raising his voice, and yet left no doubt as to who decided what in those rooms. "I saw a man who is not used to being wrong," she said at last, "but who did not enjoy the thought that he might be. And I saw that when he listened, he really did listen, not just wait for his turn to speak." Her father nodded slowly. "Then perhaps there is hope," he said, "not only for our land, but for the others who have been told they owe more than they do." As the day wore on, word began to move quietly through the village that Clara Hart had climbed the hill and spoken to the Duke himself. No one knew exactly what had been said, but guesses grew like weeds. Some said she had begged on her knees, and he had taken pity. Others said she had shouted at him and he had thrown her out. The truth lay somewhere in between, quieter and more complicated than either story wanted to be. Clara did not correct any of it. She simply went about her work, fetching water, tending the small stove, helping her father with the simple tasks that tired him far more than they used to. Yet she noticed that when other tenants passed by their fence, they looked at her differently, with a mixture of curiosity and a kind of cautious respect, as if she had stepped onto a bridge that most of them had only ever watched from a distance. Up at Ashbourne, in a room lined with shelves and heavy with the scent of ink, Adrian sat alone with the ledgers open in front of him. Light from the late afternoon filtered through the tall windows, laying pale bars across the pages. He moved slowly, line by line, comparing entries, tracing the small differences that now stood out like faint bruises beneath the surface of the numbers. With each discrepancy he found, Clara's calm voice seemed to echo in the back of his mind. "We have already given. Count it." He rubbed at his leg absently, feeling the old ache in the bone that the physicians had told him he would simply have to learn to live with. Most wounds, they had said, did not vanish. They only changed shape. As he turned another page and saw yet again how easily a small theft could be hidden inside a trusted system, he realized that the same was true of estates and of the men who ran them. Some damage could not be undone, only acknowledged and stopped from spreading. Somewhere between the quiet of his study and the worn boards of the Hart house, a thin, unseen line connected his choices to their survival. For the first time in years, he felt the full weight of it pressing into his hands as clearly as any set of reins. The news came 3 days later, carried not by gossip this time, but by a knock at the heart door that sounded very different from Edwin Crow's clipped rhythm. When Clara opened it, a younger footman stood there, his coat neat but not grand, his gaze steady but not cold. "Miss Hart," he said, inclining his head. "His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne, requests your presence at the house. On the hill this afternoon, if your duties at home allow it." Clara felt her pulse quicken. Invitations from houses like Ashbourne did not land on kitchen thresholds every day, especially not addressed to tenants by name. She glanced back at her father. He was sitting up in bed, a blanket around his shoulders, his eyes already fixed on her. "Tell him she will come," Thomas Hart said before she could speak. "If she refuses a duke, I will never hear the end of it, sick or not." There was a faint spark of humor in his voice, the first she had heard in many days. Clara answered the footman with a small nod. "I will be there," she said. As she climbed the hill again that afternoon, the sky had cleared just enough to let a thin band of light stretch along the horizon. The fields below held the marks of both struggle and persistence, furrows dark and ready, like open pages waiting for seed. At the gates, the guards recognized her and did not ask as many questions. There was a sense of something already decided in the way they opened the iron bars. Inside, a maid led her not to the grand hall this time, but along a quieter corridor where the air smelled faintly of wax and old books. They stopped before a door that stood half open. "He is inside," the maid said softly. "You may go in." Adrian stood by one of the tall windows, looking out over the eastern fields. From here, Clara could see the small patch that was theirs, a modest square of land stitched into a much larger quilt. For a moment she looked at it through his eyes and wondered how often he had noticed it before her name was attached to its fate. He turned when the door closed behind her. The sunlight, such as it was, caught the line of his profile, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested on the windowsill as if he needed that small point of contact with something solid. "Miss Hart," he said, "thank you for coming." "You sent for me, Your Grace," she replied. "I thought it wise to discover whether your news concerns our roof or the lack of it." The corner of his mouth almost curved, not quite a smile, but close. "Let me ease that particular fear first," he said. "I have completed my review of your account and of several others. Your father's payments were recorded on receipts, but not fully entered into the estate ledgers. The fault lies not with you." He moved away from the window and picked up a folded document from the table. "Your debt is cleared," he continued. "In fact, you have credit in your favor. I have signed a new agreement. You and your father are secure on that land for as long as you wish to work it, at a fair rent that will not be altered without your knowledge." Clara felt the words land inside her one by one, like stones dropping into water, sending ripples through everything she had been braced to endure. "You are certain," she said quietly, needing to hear it again, not because she doubted him, but because the world had not trained her to trust such reversals. "I am certain," Adrian answered. "Edwin Crow is no longer steward of Ashbourne. There will be a full accounting of his actions. That process will be handled by those whose task it is to weigh such matters, but the tenants will be corrected for every coin wrongly taken." She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Some of the tension that had settled into her shoulders over the years began to lift, not all at once, but like frost melting in thin lines where the sun touched it first. "You did not have to do all of this because of us," she said. "We are only one small piece of your land." "Perhaps," he said, "but when a small piece is cracked, it tells you something about the foundation. You showed me that." There was a pause, a quiet in which the ticking of a clock on the mantel sounded unexpectedly loud. Adrian studied her face, as if weighing another decision that did not involve ink or ledgers. "There is one more thing I must say to you," he added, "not as your landlord, but as the man whose name was on that notice." She waited, her hands loosely clasped, the rough fabric of her dress grounding her in the moment. "The night of the storm," he said slowly, "when a carriage was trapped in the mud on the road below your house, you went out into that rain. You could have stayed inside, but you did not. You pulled a stranger and his horses out of the earth's grip as if you had done it 100 times. That stranger was me." Clara's breath caught. Images flickered through her mind. The weight of the rope in her hands, the splash of mud, the flash of lightning on a face that had seemed too far from her world to remember. Now, standing before her in a fine house, that same face looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and something like regret. "You said nothing," she murmured. "You rode away." "I did," he admitted. "I told myself there was no proper way to repay what you had done. I see now that was an excuse. Sometimes it is easier to ride away from a debt of the heart than to look it squarely in the eye." His gaze did not waver. "You saved my life that night, Miss Hart. I did not know your name then. I know it now. And I intend to live in such a way that the land you stand on no longer feels like ground that can be taken from you without question." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them was still there, in the cut of his coat and the simplicity of her dress, in the height of the ceilings and the memory of low beams in her kitchen. Yet beneath all of that lay something more level. Two people who had met once in the dark, and again in the full light of how much power one's signature could hold. "Then we are even," she said gently. "You have given us back our home." He shook his head, a small, almost weary motion. "No," he replied. "We are not even. There are some things that do not balance on any scale, I know. But we are, perhaps, no longer strangers." Outside, beyond the glass, the fields waited for spring. The road where mud had tried to keep its grip on a carriage was drying, slowly, under a hesitant sun. And in a quiet room at the heart of Ashbourne, a duke and a farmer's daughter stood facing each other, both aware that the choices they made from this moment on would write a different kind of record than any ledger had ever held.